Islamist terror, a global threat? In the interview, the Middle East analyst Guido Steinberg.
Mr. Steinberg, a terrorist attacked the Canadian Parliament this week. There were several deaths. The man had an Islamist background, but apparently he acted single-handedly. How can a state protect itself from such lone attackers?
Basically, there's no protection against lone attackers. If they do most of their planning in secret, the security agencies have almost nothing to go on. But in recent years, we've seen again that our security agencies haven't even been able to stop those they are aware of. For instance, after being prevented from going to Syria, from becoming active as terrorists.
Let's take a look at Syria and Iraq, where the terrorist militia Islamic State is fighting for power. How was this group of jihadis able to become so strong?
To start with, there were political mistakes, and the biggest one was made by the Iraqi government. After the US withdrawal in 2011, it did everything to keep the Sunnis and the secularists who'd been elected by many Sunnis away from power. It began persecuting Sunni politicians and also persecuted members of tribal militias that the Americans had recruited. The result was that large parts of the Sunni population in western and northwestern Iraq saw the government, now in 2014, as their greatest enemy. And they did nothing to prevent the advance of IS. This is the reason for the current problems. And on top of that, the Syrian civil war. The collapse of state structures in the neighboring country encouraged this situation.
Syria, Iraq, Turkey in the north, a NATO partner. Why is Ankara so reluctant to move against IS? Why are they just letting it happen?
Ankara simply has very different aims. There are two priorities for Ankara: to topple the Assad regime in Damascus. The neo-Ottomanist foreign policy of Erdogan's government in recent years has in practice failed, and the toppling of Assad could perhaps be the last success to aim for. Secondly, it's a question of curtailing the Kurdish PKK, and the Syrian Kurds belong to this organization. And only then comes the war against IS. It seems as if the Turkish government is not taking this fight as seriously as we are. And in the end, this leads to an appearance that it is in fact supporting that organization. Some things have changed in the past year and a half, but we can still talk about passive support or tolerance. If this continues, it will be really difficult to act against IS effectively without determined help from Turkey.
There are a lot of foreigners in the IS ranks, Europeans and Americans. Is it possible to calculate how many?
Yes, there are quite precise numbers, for Europe in particular. There are an estimated 3,000 fighters, but most of them are either back or aren't members of IS. So we have to assume a low four-digit number who have been part of IS since 2013. What's worrying about the past months is that this number keeps increasing.
It's a proper jihadist international that's come together. Could you explain how this happened? How did this movement of political Islam become so internationalized?
With the terrorist attacks of 9/11. At the time, it was still an exclusively Arab organization, Al-Qaeda, which was strongly dominated by Egyptians and Saudis. But since then, we've seen that the scene has become very internationalized. For example, Kurds and Turks have joined, Afghans, Pakistanis, but also many Europeans, including European converts. This has to do with two things: with the ideology, which is by principle internationalistic. I think it also has to do with a certain susceptibility within the diaspora. Somebody who lives in a diaspora is already caught between two societies per se, the homeland and the country where he now lives. And this internationalist idea has a strong resonance. It's stronger in Germany than in Egypt, for instance. But mainly, there are the Western interventions, and we're seeing their impact at the moment, especially in Iraq and Syria. The US-British intervention in Iraq, the destruction of state structures, is the cause of what we're experiencing at the moment. Not only the strengthening of terrorist organizations, but the quasi-formation of a state that has managed to destroy national borders, at least between Iraq and Syria.
In your book, Al-Qaeda's German Fighters, you talk about the lives of jihadis. Has a particular profile become apparent? Are there typical international jihadis? Who's going to war there?
Internationalen Dschihadisten, wer zieht in den Krieg dorthin?
There's no typical profile anymore. The national profile has completely disappeared. In Germany in 2006 and 2007, it seemed as if many Turks or Kurds were joining the jihadis, but that immediately stopped. They're from all over, but they tend to be young and they're getting younger, and now there are women too. They're from all levels of society. But at least when it comes to the events in Syria and Iraq, one has to say that there has been a social shift. In 2001, Al-Qaeda was more of a middle-class phenomenon. There were many students from the Arab world, even if they weren't such good students. Now it's predominantly urban lower classes who are joining the fight, although not completely. And this is very understandable in Europe. They come from the difficult districts of cities such as Brussels, Berlin or Bonn.
How do these jihadis organize themselves? Does it all go via the internet?
No, we know very precisely in terms of Europe. It's less the internet that leads to radicalization, and recruitment definitely doesn't take place via the internet. It's mainly friends. People are introduced into the scene by a friend or a colleague that they know well. Then they meet a preacher, watch videos together, and slowly a small group develops the idea of going to Syria or to Iraq or to Somalia or Pakistan. We shouldn't ignore these other war zones.
The police and the security agencies are now warning against the dangers posed by people who've returned, people who fought in Afghanistan or Syria, dangers for the West. How do you see this threat? Is it latent or direct?
I think the events in Ottawa show very clearly what the threat looks like at the moment. Even though there are still unknowns, I think we can talk of a jihadist background. There's a big danger posed by the high number of people returning. In every European and Western country, we're talking about three-digit numbers. Here in Germany, there are over 400 people who've gone to Syria or Iraq at some point in the past 3 years. And it'll be almost impossible for our security agencies to process these high numbers. In Canada, we've seen that there was information, but not enough capacity. In the next few years, it'll be a question of boosting staff and funds. But we also have to make our security agencies more professional, to orient them towards a new threat that's not so different from that posed by those who returned from Pakistan, for instance, but one that's much bigger and more difficult to overcome.
How should the West, America, and the European Union deal with the region? What has to change from a political point of view?
To begin with, we have to get used to the idea that there are countries in the region which will remain unstable for a long time. I'm thinking mainly of Syria. The civil war will probably last some time, and that will offer almost perfect conditions for the activities of the jihadists. That means we're looking at a long-term danger threatening us from the Arab world. And I think that the most important step is to bring Turkey into line with the Americans, so that it's possible to fight IS more effectively. It won't succeed without Turkey. Secondly, there's still some hope that Iraq will become stable. The Europeans in particular should do more there, those who basically washed their hands of Iraq for 11 years, at least those who didn't get involved in the war. Basically, it's a question of stabilizing the neighboring countries, which are not necessarily so directly affected now, but are IS targets. I'm thinking of Lebanon, Jordan, and possibly Saudi Arabia. We're going to have to work more closely with them. At the same time, this has to be linked to a demand that they change their domestic policies, so that they can stay stable in the long term.
Your employer, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, advises the German government. Are you sometimes asked how the wars are changing the map in the Middle East? And will the state still look the same after the wars?
Yes, that is something people ask me. I'm a bit skeptical when they start announcing the death of certain states in the region. So far, there's only one border that's in huge danger, the one between Iraq and Syria. But we have at least one state, Iraq, where there's still a great deal of nationalism, Iraqi nationalism and not Arab nationalism. If this state implements correct, good policies towards Sunnis and uses its resources reasonably and works on the raging corruption, then there's a good chance these borders will endure. But in some cases, only if there are federal solutions, like for the Kurds in Iraq. It will also be necessary to think about how Syria could look when that war does finally end. It probably won't survive in its current form. With the other states, I think that we can count on the borders lasting for a long time.
Guido Steinberg, terrorism and political Islam expert at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. Thank you for answering our questions.
Thank you.